A cold evening breeze swept through the bustling cafe as Ayesha scrolled through her phone, sipping her caramel latte. She glanced up and smirked as she saw her best friend, Sara, walk in, adjusting her scarf and scanning the room. Ayesha waved her over, her gold bracelets jingling as she moved her hand. Sara sat down with a sigh, placing her worn-out bag on the table. Traffic was crazy, she said, pulling out her phone to check for messages. Ayesha leaned forward, an amused glint in her eyes. Forget traffic. Tell me about this boyfriend of yours, she teased, resting her chin on her palm. I heard he's not exactly living the high life. Sara's face tensed, but she forced a smile. Zayan's a good guy, Ayesha. He's hardworking, kind. Ayesha burst into laughter, cutting her off. Kind? Sara, kindness doesn't pay bills. I mean, come on. He doesn't even have a car, does he? Sara shifted uncomfortably. He's just starting out. He's got big dreams. Ayesha rolled her eyes. Dreams don't buy diamonds, babe. She leaned back, crossing her arms. Look, I get it. You're in your romantic phase, but let's be real. When was the last time he took you somewhere fancy? I bet he can't even afford a decent dinner date. Sara's fingers tightened around her cup. He's trying. Not everyone is born into money, Ayesha. Ayesha scoffed. Trying won't get you anywhere. You deserve someone who can actually give you a life worth living. Love doesn't fill an empty fridge. Sara inhaled sharply, hurt flashing in her eyes. But before she could respond, a voice interrupted them. Am I interrupting something? Both girls turned. Zayan stood there, holding a simple bouquet of daisies in his hands. His jeans were slightly faded, his jacket not designer like the ones Ayesha was used to seeing. But his eyes held warmth, confidence. Ayesha smirked, leaning back in her seat. Not at all. We were just talking about you. Zayan smiled politely and turned to Sara. I was nearby and thought I'd surprise you. He handed her the flowers. Sara's face softened as she took them. Ayesha chuckled under her breath. Daisies? How humble. Zayan turned to her, tilting his head slightly. A flower's worth isn't in its price, but in the meaning behind it. Ayesha raised an eyebrow. That's cute. But let's be honest, Zayan. Do you really think you can give Sara the life she deserves? Silence hung in the air. Sara opened her mouth to speak, but Zayan gently squeezed her hand, his expression calm. That's not for you to decide, Ayesha. Ayesha laughed lightly. Oh, please. You don't actually believe love is enough, do you? Zayan's lips curled into a small smile, but his eyes carried something unreadable. That depends. If love is just a word to you, then no. But if it's a foundation, then yes, it's enough. More than enough. Sara felt her heart tighten. But Ayesha? She simply shook her head, amused. Let's see how long that belief lasts, she muttered, sipping her latte again. Neither of them knew it yet, but this conversation was just the beginning of something much bigger. The air between them felt thick, charged with an unspoken tension. Ayesha tapped her manicured nails on the table, her smirk never fading. You know what, Zayan? Let's make this interesting. Sara shifted in her seat, sensing trouble. Ayesha, don't. Ayesha held up a hand, cutting her off. No. I just want to understand. She turned to Zayan, eyes gleaming with mischief. You talk about love like it's enough. Prove it. Let's say, she paused dramatically. You have 1 month to show Sara that love can compete with luxury. Sara's mouth parted in disbelief. This isn't some game, Ayesha. But Ayesha ignored her, leaning forward. 1 month, Zayan. No fancy gifts, no grand gestures. Just love. If, by the end of it, Sara still thinks you're enough, I'll shut up. But if she starts seeing reality, you let her go. Sara's heart pounded. That's ridiculous. I don't need to prove anything to anyone. Zayan studied Ayesha for a moment, then glanced at Sara. His fingers tightened slightly around hers before he turned back to Ayesha, calm as ever. And if I win? Ayesha scoffed. Win what? You don't have anything I'd want. Zayan smirked slightly. Then if I win, you stop judging people by their bank accounts. For the first time, Ayesha's confident expression flickered. Fine, she said, crossing her arms. But don't say I didn't warn you, Sara. Love might feel magical now, but let's see if it still shines when reality hits. Zayan didn't say anything. He simply took Sara's hand, stood up, and gave her a reassuring squeeze. Let's go, he murmured. As they walked out of the cafe, Sara turned to him. Why did you agree to this? You don't have to prove anything. Zayan smiled, but there was something else in his gaze, something unreadable. Maybe not. But sometimes people don't understand the value of something until they see it with their own eyes. Behind them, Ayesha watched, sipping her coffee, completely unaware that she had just set something into motion, something that would change all of their lives forever. The days passed, and Sara found herself paying more attention to the little things. Zayan hadn't changed. He was still the same guy who made her laugh with his silly jokes, who listened to her rants without judgment, who looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. But now, with Ayesha's challenge hanging over them, everything felt different. One evening, Zayan surprised her with a handwritten letter instead of a text. Since texts disappear, and I want you to have something that stays, he had said with a grin. Sara had rolled her eyes at the time, but later that night, she read it again and again, tracing his messy handwriting with her fingers. Another day, he took her on a date, not to a restaurant, but to a quiet rooftop with fairy lights he had borrowed from a friend. They ate homemade sandwiches and talked about their dreams under the open sky. One day, I'll have my own architecture firm, he had said, staring at the stars. I won't always be struggling, Sara. I promise. She had squeezed his hand. I don't care about that, Zayan. I know, he had whispered. But I care. Sara was happy. She really was. But Ayesha wasn't letting it go. Every time they met, Ayesha made comments, subtle, sharp. That's a pretty dress, Sara. Oh, wait, did you buy it? Or was it another one of Zayan's thoughtful gifts? Or, so, how's the love experiment going? Still surviving on rooftop picnics? Sara always brushed it off, but one night, Ayesha hit a nerve. She, Sara, and a few friends were out for dinner at a fancy restaurant, one that Ayesha had chosen. The place screamed luxury, from the velvet seats to the waiters dressed better than most people. Sara hesitated before ordering. The prices were insane. Ayesha smirked. What's wrong? Not used to places like this anymore. Sara forced a laugh. Nothing like that. Ayesha leaned back, twirling her wine glass. You know, it's funny. You say you don't care about money, but here you are, hesitating over a menu. Sara felt her face heat up. Another friend, Adil, chuckled. Come on, Ayesha. Not everything is about money. Ayesha shrugged. I'm just saying, love is cute and all, but at the end of the day, comfort matters too. Sara clenched her fists under the table. She knew Ayesha was testing her, pushing her. And the worst part? It was working. Because deep down, a tiny voice whispered, what if she's right? And that thought scared her more than anything. Sara tried to ignore it. She really did. But Ayesha's words stuck in her mind like a splinter she couldn't remove. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her thoughts wouldn't stop. She thought about the fancy restaurant, the hesitation she had felt while looking at the menu. She thought about Zayan's rooftop picnic, the simplicity, the effort, the love. And then she thought about the future. Would they always be like this? Struggling? Making things work with whatever they had? She hated herself for even thinking it, but the doubt was there now, gnawing at her. The next day, Zayan picked her up after work. He had that familiar, easy smile on his face, the one that usually melted all her worries away. But today, it didn't. You okay? He asked as they walked toward the park. It was their usual spot, the place where they could just talk without distractions. Sara hesitated, then sighed. Zayan, do you ever think about the future? Zayan chuckled. All the time. I mean, really think about it, she pressed. Like, where we'll be in 5 years. 10 years. He slowed down, turning to face her. Sara, is this about Ayesha? She looked away. It's not just her. It's everything. I know love matters, but you're scared. Zayan finished for her. His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't even surprised. Just quiet. Sara swallowed hard. I don't want to be scared, Zayan. I want to believe that love is enough. But what if it's not? For the first time, Zayan's smile faltered. He took a deep breath, looking out at the trees, as if choosing his next words carefully. I won't lie to you, Sara. Life is hard, and love doesn't pay rent. He turned to her, eyes filled with something deep, something raw. But love does something else. It makes the struggle worth it. It makes the journey matter. Sara felt her throat tighten. And what if, one day, I start feeling like it's not enough? Zayan's jaw clenched for a second, but then he smiled, soft, knowing. Then I'll fight for you, he said. Every single day, I'll fight for you. Sara stared at him, feeling a mixture of guilt, love, and confusion all at once. But before she could say anything, her phone buzzed. A message from Ayesha. Big surprise for you tomorrow. Let's see if you still believe in fairy tales after this. Winking face, Sara's stomach twisted. She had no idea what Ayesha was planning, but something told her it was going to change everything. Sara arrived at the cafe the next day with a strange sense of unease. Ayesha had insisted she come alone, and that alone was enough to put her on edge. As she walked in, she spotted Ayesha sitting at their usual table, a satisfied smirk already in place. But she wasn't alone. Sitting across from her was a man Sara didn't recognize, sharp suit, expensive watch, confident posture. He looked up and smiled as she approached. Sara, meet Rayan, Ayesha said smoothly, swirling her coffee. He's a close friend of mine. Runs a few businesses, travels a lot. You two should talk. Sara's eyebrows knitted together. Ayesha, what is this? Rayan chuckled, leaning forward. Relax. It's just a conversation. His voice was smooth, practiced. Ayesha told me a lot about you. Said you're smart, ambitious, and that you might need someone who can actually match your potential. Sara shot Ayesha a sharp look. You set me up? Ayesha sighed dramatically. Sara, I'm just giving you options. I mean, be honest with yourself. Do you really see a future with Zayan? Or are you just holding on because it feels safe? Sara's heart pounded. This is ridiculous. I love Zayan. Rayan smiled, completely unfazed. That's sweet. But love doesn't last when life gets tough. He folded his hands on the table. Look, I'm not here to convince you of anything. I just want you to think. What do you want your future to look like? Struggling to make ends meet, constantly sacrificing? Or a life where you never have to second guess if you can afford something? Sara clenched her fists under the table. You don't know me. Rayan leaned back, nodding. You're right. But I know people, and I know that in the end, love isn't enough. Sara pushed her chair back. I don't need to hear this. But as she stood up, Ayesha's voice stopped her cold. If you're so sure about Zayan, why are you shaking? Sara froze. She hadn't even realized it, her hands trembling at her sides. Ayesha's expression softened, just for a moment. Sara, I just don't want you to regret your choices later. Sara swallowed hard. Without another word, she turned and walked out. Her mind was a storm. She needed to see Zayan. She needed to remind herself why she had chosen him. But when she got to his small apartment, her heart stopped. Through the slightly open door, she saw Zayan inside, talking to someone. A woman she didn't recognize. And then, before she could even process it, she saw something that made her entire world crash. The woman reached forward and took Zayan's hand. And he didn't pull away. Sara's breath hitched. She stood frozen outside the door, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. The woman, elegant, well-dressed, Someone who clearly didn't belong in Zayan's small apartment was holding his hand. And he wasn't pulling away. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind. Who was she? Why was she here? Why did Zayan look so calm? Her fingers curled into fists as she forced herself to move, pushing the door open. Zayan. He turned sharply, his eyes widening in surprise. For a second, guilt flashed across his face, but it was gone just as quickly. Sara. His voice was careful, controlled. The woman let go of his hand, stepping back slightly. She glanced at Sara, then at Zayan, an unreadable expression on her face. Sara ignored the woman. Her eyes were locked on Zayan. Who is she? Zayan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Sara, this isn't what it looks like. Sara let out a short, bitter laugh. It never is it? The woman finally spoke, her voice calm, measured. I'm Meher. She turned to Zayan. I'll let you explain. And just like that, she walked past Sara and out the door. Sara folded her arms, waiting. I'm listening. Zayan hesitated, then sighed. She's my cousin. Sara blinked. Your cousin? Yes. She's been helping me with something. His jaw clenched for a moment before he continued. Sara, I didn't tell you everything about my situation. I've been struggling more than you know. He took a deep breath. I borrowed money. A lot of it. And now I'm in trouble. Sara felt her stomach drop. What kind of trouble? The kind where people come knocking, expecting repayment. His voice was low, almost ashamed. Meher found out. She offered to help, but I didn't want to involve you. I thought I could handle it myself. Sara's mind reeled. Why didn't you tell me? Because I knew this would happen. His voice rose slightly before he quickly composed himself. I knew you'd start questioning us. Questioning me? Sara shook her head. That's not fair, Zayan. You should have trusted me. And what would that have changed? His voice softened, and for the first time, she saw the exhaustion in his eyes. Would it have made the burden any lighter? Or would it have just made you doubt us more? She had no answer. Because deep down, she knew he was right. Ayesha's words, Rayyan's questions, her own creeping doubts. This was exactly what they had been talking about. Love doesn't pay the bills. Zayan reached for her hand, but she stepped back. He froze. Sara, I need to think, she whispered. His face fell, but he nodded. Okay. Sara turned and walked away. For the first time since she met Zayan, she wasn't sure if love was enough.